Storytelling has always served to convey a thematic message or cautionary tale under the guise of being something that's entertaining, and therefore it educates the consumer without the audience realizing it. This fundamental purpose for storytelling is utilized to educate and advise the demographic with the lowest attention span, children. Children have a habit of not listening and giving naught credence to the wisdom of their parents. Their parents will tell their children to be cautious of strangers or not to lie, things that are logically and morally correct. However, these things will be boring to listen to for the juvenile mind of a child, which is why fairy tales became a necessity in culture. They have since been one of the main revenues of storytelling in the grand scheme of the creative industry. Parents may want their child to understand the dangers of society and be aware of the characteristics of people that could pose a threat. Little Red Riding Hood is a fairy tale that will deliver on a resonant message that will stay in the child's mind through fear if nothing else. This is a fairy tale that checks all the boxes. The main character has a vague and interchangeable description, allowing children watching to easily put themselves in their shoes. The antagonist representation of the stranger is drastically exaggerated to make them a vicious and predatory creature. It exaggerates the consequences of not listening to your peers by depicting her being eaten alive. The Little Red Riding Hood, not unlike all fairy tales, subliminally inform children with life lessons they will need to survive in a society of our own making in terms of morality, rationale and intelligence. It's all happening under their nose. Meanwhile, they're watching the cunning big bad wolf who can inexplicably talk, and they're not asking questions. The fairy tale is tapping into the children's need and desire for fantastical stories that deviate from the boring world, further liberating their imagination. Yet, storytelling has evolved exponentially and has strived to be so much more than it was when fairy tales were initially conceived. Conveying a thematic message remains as the foundation of storytelling, although it has transcended into the realms of fantasy. In this video essay, I will be exploring the differences that distinctly separate the genres fairy tale and fantasy, regardless of how similar they may sound. Fantasy stories inherit the typical fairy tale hero, except they give the characters depth and imperfections, and sometimes they don't have any heroic attributes to speak of. An essay from Maria Nikolajeva describes the following dynamics of archaic to postmodern fantasy. The essential difference between the fairy tale hero and the fantasy protagonist is the latter often lacks heroic features. They can be scarred and even reluctant to perform a task. Fantasy characters are usually portrayed as less of a hero and closer to a mere protagonist the audience can identify with. As a vehicle to identify the differences and nuances between these two genres, I will be using the animation film from Pixar, Ratatouille. Ratatouille is a fairy tale told in feature length. The film sends a message that people can achieve anything they set their minds to, despite their background, class, ethnicity, nationality, or in this case, your species. Rats are considered as rodents, and their presence is especially frowned upon in the kitchen of an Italian restaurant, for example. When the film depicts a rat covertly controlling a professional chef, using strands of his hair under his hat, the script is clearly trying to convey a message to impressionable children that they should strive for their dreams despite how improbable they might seem. It challenges stereotypes that are manifested due to presumptions based on appearance. Not to mention that, of course, the rat speaks fluent English, but the audience isn't inclined to question any of it, but rather enjoy the story for what it is. If Ratatouille was a fantasy piece, we would have an elaborate origin story of how a scientific experiment gone wrong merged the rat's brain with a human being. Perhaps something results in a nervous gas that makes animals more intelligent, like in Rise of the Planet of the Apes. In the online essay, The Time Machine and the Origins of Modern Fantasy, the writer's reference to the difference between fantasy and science fiction are as follows. In the science fictional world, if you asked us how something worked, you would get an answer that made some sort of sense in terms of contemporary science, while in a fantasy world, you would get no such answer. would not in fact feel inclined to ask many questions about how things worked at all, being far too preoccupied with reacting to the wonders and horrors. I would have to disagree with this statement, as I think this assertion unnecessarily complicates the two genres. What he describes as fantasy actually falls under fairy tale. Science fiction and fantasy have a strong connection, in that they both build their stakes, characters, conflict and themes in a setting that contains elements that do not exist. I would argue that whether the fiction is trying to reflect or borrow from real science is inconsequential. What matters is the rules the story establishes from the ground up, despite how unreal or grounded in reality it might be. The suspension of one's disbelief is not hindered just because the events happening are unlikely. They would be hindered, for example, if Superman easily died from a single mortal bullet wound, when you are specifically told he is bulletproof. In this case, the opposite of realism takes you out of the experience, because the story has cemented in your mind that the world you are immersed in works in a certain way, detached from reality. In the movie Thor, the titular character has a line of dialogue that is telling of what I'm trying to communicate.
Your ancestors called it magic, and you call it science. Well, I come from a place where they're one and the same thing. My father explained it to me like this, that your world is one of the 9 realms of the cosmos, linked to each other by the branches of Yggdrasil, the world's tree. Now you see it every day without realizing.
The term science fiction really starts to sound like an oxymoron when you consider that one man's magic is another alien's science, if you will. To be less hypothetical, we can look at Star Wars as a franchise that started as a fairy tale before George Lucas introduced us to the science fiction angle of Star Wars. He revealed that the Force stems from a microorganism referred to as midichlorians.
What are midichlorians?
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Inside your cells, yes. And we are symbionts with them.
Symbionts?
Life forms living together for mutual advantage. Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force. They continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force.
With that revelation, George Lucas broke through the formula of fairy tale and sent Star Wars into the realm of fantasy and science fiction. Once that was done, it couldn't be undone, and the Star Wars fandom went into a frenzy. It was polarizing. There was now method to the madness of the Star Wars universe, and the debate of how these midichlorians worked erupted, to the degree that the craze was no longer just about the theme of Star Wars, but also what the rules are in the universe and how the Force works. The tale of Star Wars was transformed, and fans began to vehemently argue on the internet.
We'll use the Force. That's not how the Force works.
This escalated into the creation of Wikipedia, which is an entire website dedicated to explaining facets of the Star Wars universe. Now let's use an example of intellectual property that uses existing fairy tales and folklore as elements for fantasy. The Witcher, written by Andrzej Sapkowski, is a series of books that uses Polish folklore and implements it into a believable fantasy world. Believable in the sense that The Witcher establishes lore that explains how the monsters, witches and magical elements came to be in the world, thus establishing rules that render The Witcher a fantasy story rather than a fairy tale. The Witcher alludes to an event called the Conjunction of the Spheres that set the history and the future of the fictional world in motion.
The gods allowed unholy forces to slip into our domain. The offspring of that cataclysm was the nefarious force called magic. Yet we did not banish it, instead studying the vile arcane for our own power and wealth.
The world went from an ordinary medieval setting that humanity once knew to a cataclysm which affected the multiverse. This trapped the supernatural forces of ghouls, vampires, werewolves, leshens, strigers, and spectres, and the vast selection of monsters found in Polish folklore. In general, when the writers of stories present the reader with lore such as this, it sets a precedent and informs the reader that this is set in a world that demands heed and attention to the details, as that is where the stakes, themes, and the tone of the tale are found. Fairy tales are mere thematically resonant stories. Fantasy offers a new simulated reality for the reader to get lost in, and said stories to take place in. That is what sets them apart.